This is episode 454 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by Veronica Mayer Bryant. She is the acting director of Curricular Improvement at the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. And we're going to primarily be talking about her organization's new report, What Will They Learn? And it's going to focus, the report is, on various aspects of college education, including right here in New Mexico, with a focus on civics and other specific subject areas, and whether her organization sees New Mexico's colleges as providing that needed education. But welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Veronica.
Thank you. Glad to be joining you today.
Yeah, and I want to, before we get into the report itself, can you talk a little bit about the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, and kind of what they do and what their perspective is, broadly speaking, on higher education, and anything more about the organization, your involvement in it, that you would like to share?
Absolutely. So the American Council of Trustees and Alumni is an organization that's been around since 1995 here in DC. We are a nonprofit, a completely independent nonprofit of any government funding, unlike others. And we're dedicated primarily to what we call the three pillars. So academic freedom, academic excellence, and higher education accountability. So all around reform in higher education through those three pillars. And as our name implies, we work very closely, especially with trustees and alumni, but also with other stakeholders in the higher education space. So that will include faculty, other administrators, like say university presidents, and even to some extent, we can provide advice to legislators, as well as, in my case, for curricular improvement, not just talk to faculty, but also to prospective college students about what colleges might make the most sense for their future.
And your organization is based in the DC area,
Correct.
But you work across the United States, and kind of again, before we get too far down the path on the report itself, what is the general take? You mentioned a few things: academic freedom, excellence, and accountability. How, broadly speaking, are American institutes of higher learning performing on those various areas? And I realize we could probably do an entire podcast on academic freedom, excellence, and accountability, but kind of give us the elevator speech on each. Are colleges fulfilling their mission, or as ACTA sees it, being effective in those areas or not? And which do you see as the primary issues right now?
Right. I would say all three are pretty significant issues, and my organization certainly sees it that way. And they are significant issues because colleges are not delivering in any of these three areas, not to the extent that they really could. We're working pretty heavily on the academic freedom front. You may have heard about that Stanford Academic Freedom Conference last week. I think that's been in the news a lot, and I think it's an indicator about, it's just one example where lots of faculty and thought leaders nationwide are seeing that their ideas are being censored, that they are either being officially removed from their positions or sort of soft pushed out in the case of, say, Amy Wax, but hard in the case of, say, Joshua Katz, for having a sort of an unorthodox thought for the academic world. However, there are organizations out there that are working to unify academics, university leaders, like administrators, as well as faculty themselves and professors of other types, to to get a greater freedom, such as the Academic Freedom Alliance, which is pretty new, right? But also, FIRE certainly helps and supports. ACTA does
What's
as
the
well.
Academic Freedom Alliance?
I
Most
think
people are familiar with FIRE, the Foundation for
yeah,
Individual Rights in Education. They do a lot of lawsuits defending academic freedom on campus, and I
and
think
they've
they've been
actually
involved in New Mexico.
expanded. They are now called, I think, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression,
Oh,
to
okay.
go beyond the education sphere. So, the Academic Freedom Alliance, I believe, might have been founded in 2020, but I'm not sure of that. By Robert George at Princeton, and some other people who, so kind of crossed the intellectual, political, like ideological spectrum, but felt that viewpoints that were not, like I said, kind of not orthodox, and this sort of new version of orthodoxy, which is very left, hard, progressive, are not being allowed to be expressed, let alone really listened to by students and administrators. But professors weren't allowed to say in the classroom, in op-eds, or anywhere in some ways, thoughts that were not really kind of approved by the groupthink among faculty and administrators. There's also Heterodox Academy, which works very closely with faculty in particular on this issue. So there's a lot of movement in that direction, which is exciting. And I would say FIRE seems to have been very successful in pointing the finger at these problems.
Right.
But the question is whether the administration is going to be willing to do what it takes to give that support to that movement, right?
Yeah, and academic freedom could mean, just what's taught on campuses, I presume. I guess it's worth kind of hashing out a little bit of detail on what academic freedom means, because, you obviously want to have some level of freedom for expression of individual students. We had events at the University of New Mexico. I don't know if you heard about it recently, that Tommy Lauren, I think that's the way her name is pronounced. She's
I've heard of
commentator on, kind of Fox News,
her.
definitely on the right of the political spectrum. And it wound up being a little bit of a riot. And she was, I believe, unable to even speak, or maybe spoke and was interrupted. But
Oh, wow.
I would assume that falls under academic freedom as well, freedom
Absolutely.
of expression on campus.
Yeah, it does. So it's not just about professors, right? And what they teach in the classroom. It's about kind of the whole campus environment and what people are, so freedom of expression more broadly, right? So not just in the classroom, not just in campus clubs, so extracurricular activities that might be on campus, but anything that occurs on a university campus in some sense is kind of academic, right? Because in some way it's sort of supporting that endeavor that a university is supposed to be there for, which is actually learning. So anything that kind of that detracts people from being able to have those free exchange of ideas in order to support their learning once they've graduated, and to be able to graduate with exposure to a range of ideas, is jeopardizing that learning, and therefore jeopardizing academic freedom. That's the way we see it. It's interesting you mentioned the thing about UNM, because ACTA, so one of the endeavors that we have for supporting accountability at higher ed is we actually rank all the states on a range of different a range of different qualities, and one of them is kind of supporting freedom of expression, and New Mexico does pretty well in that one. Your speech code policies anyway, for your public institutions, which are almost all of your institutions,
Right.
ranked 19th in the nation for being free, which is pretty good.
Okay. Well, before we move on, I do want to get your kind of take on academic excellence.
Absolutely.
And accountability. And I know these are meaty subjects, but excellence in education, I think the big thing that you hear in higher education is that the curriculum is being dumbed down. You're not getting, the grade doesn't mean anything when you're taking a college course, and it just kind of is not as rigorous of an education as maybe it used to be. Without, getting into the halcyon days fallacy or any of that stuff, is this an accurate statement as far as you and your in ACTA see it?
Yeah, That is accurate. I think academic excellence is going to tie in pretty closely to what will they learn. That's where what will they learn falls under in our sort of priorities and as an organization. But absolutely, standards have been degrading. It just sounds like this sort of sad song. But standards have been degrading not only at the core curriculum level, so sort of what's required of students, as we'll get into later, but also all the way down to individual grades that professors give students on papers, but also for courses as a whole. So that sounds like a pretty accurate depiction.
Well, we can dive into that a little bit more in the talk about the report. And then accountability, I guess the only question I would have is accountability to whom, and that would probably be part of your efforts at accountability in higher education. Is it accountability to the legislature, obviously in state schools, government funded schools, or is it accountability to the students or the people paying tuition? But is accountability a problem, and if so, in what way do you see the accountability issue rise?
Right. So when ACTA talks about higher education accountability, we're largely talking about issues of administrative bloat or, misuse of funds, or not intentional, but, perhaps kind of irresponsibly use of funds. And so I guess in answer to your question about whom university would be accountable to, yeah, absolutely to those students and parents paying their tuition. If it's a public school, absolutely to the legislature, but maybe more importantly, the people to whom the legislature themselves answer, which is the public, right? Also, frankly, even professors, we can get into this in a second, but say, as universities are spending disproportionate amounts of money on administrators. Interestingly enough, New Mexico, perhaps, I don't know the salaries of your administrators. I didn't look that one up. Maybe you could speak to that, but New Mexico doesn't spend that much compared to other states on administrators at universities, but the number of administrators per student is very high. It's one of the worst stats in our rankings for New Mexico. And so it's something to keep in mind, absolutely. The rate that we have, what did I say? I haven't I wrote it down for us. Student to administrator ratio is only 12.03. That's 47th in the nation.
Okay. Well,
in other words,
yeah, let's,
that means it's the number 3, I guess, in the nation. It's pretty bad.
Right. Okay. So the report is what will they learn? And I guess we've jumped into it a little bit, but you in your report go and grade Eastern New Mexico University, Highlands University, NMSU, St. John's College, the only private institution on the list, and University of New Mexico, Western New Mexico University. You look at composition, literature, foreign language, U.S. government and history, economics, math, and science. And what are you specifically looking for on each of those subject areas? Is it just whether those are requirements for graduation, or talk a little bit about that before we really get into the data here?
Yeah, absolutely. So more in broad strokes, what will they learn grades? 4-year institutions that either are liberal arts institutions or have some kind of liberal arts and sciences program or mission within them. And for that reason, we don't grade tech, for example, New Mexico Tech, or many schools like it, on what they require all students in their arts and sciences program to take in their either general education program or degree requirements. So our team of researchers annually reviews all of the degree requirements and core curriculum requirements and course descriptions of any course that could potentially fulfill those requirements to see if they match the level of rigor in each of the subject areas that ACTA deems to be appropriate and necessary, right? To be able to get out of college as a well-rounded citizen and future employee.
Right. And so your study, just to let the cat out of the bag, St. John's College does very well. It receives an A, very small liberal arts college in Santa Fe. And then
Yes.
among the state schools, New Mexico State does the best of the rest with a C, and the others are all F's and D's. Now, I guess is this a pattern that you see where private colleges tend to perform better on your study, and state schools perform worse, or is this just kind of a New Mexico thing? And talk about where New Mexico fits in, kind of comparing and contrasting with national numbers or our neighbors.
Sure thing. So to answer your private public question, it really depends on the subject area. Maybe unsurprisingly, state schools tend to require more US government or history courses, or really we just look for each of these subject areas so that everyone's clear on this. We look at whether a school requires one course in each of these subject areas. We're not looking for some massive, year-long study. So state schools will tend to require US government or history courses, and we can get into the whys of that implementation later. State schools also tend to have more composition requirements. So just your traditional college, or maybe not traditional, just kind of essential college writing course that teaches the basics of expository writing that you can translate into writing a letter to the editor, that you can translate into writing your congressman, but all the way up to writing, a dissertation someday, or a scientific report, but kind of more serious and formal writing rather than professional writing or informal writing or creative writing. Liberal arts colleges, interestingly, and private schools don't tend to require writing, which seems kind of illogical to me, but private schools do tend to require more literature courses or more foreign language at the intermediate level than state schools do.
So maybe a marginal, marginally better performance in general by private schools across the country, but in New Mexico, it seems like a pretty stark difference. And
Yeah.
St. John's is a unique college. It's not, it's not your Notre Dame or your other, Georgetown or any of those universities. It's a pretty niche university.
Yes, it is very, very much niche. And I'll say that it is one of only 22 colleges that ACTA grades with an A nationwide, and we survey 1,135 this year.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so it's pretty hard to get an A in our ratings. And it seems to be harder every year in some ways. The F grades are higher than ever. But you will notice that New Mexico has every single school requiring a natural science, which is a tendency nationwide. The one subject that will be required almost always, especially at public schools, if nothing else is required, is natural science. So, so in that sense, New Mexico's doing great. But I'll note that, I was looking into your general education requirements for the state, because, each state has its own set of gen eds that I think the legislature works with that board of visitors or governors or whatever it's called in your state to produce. The gen ed in your state requires that there's a type of science that has lab, and that is almost always going to be an indicator of solid science. So that's something I was very pleased to see when I was looking at New Mexico compared to other states, because a lot of states will let you take these kind of quote unquote science courses that aren't really all that much using the scientific method. So
okay, so New Mexico State requires composition, which is kind of interesting. They're one of two of the schools, Eastern New Mexico being the other, that requires composition. And New Mexico State's the Aggies, the agricultural and mining institution here in New Mexico. It's a little surprising that they would require composition, whereas Eastern New Mexico's, among other things, primarily a lot of teachers, a lot of education goes on for teachers. Is composition something that it seems kind of strange that, you're talking about being able to write, I guess, paragraphs is basically what composition means. Is it surprising that an agricultural institution would be one of the two that require that?
So it just depends on your institution's priorities, I guess, right? I would say in one sense, it doesn't it doesn't seem to be too logical. In another way, your STEM guys, your Aggies, your A&M guys could really use that expository writing experience outside of their scientific environment more than your average liberal arts grad, right? So interestingly, while we don't rate New Mexico Tech, Tech also has a composition requirement, a written composition requirement. I think it's for similar reasons. And we do come across this a fair amount, that there's in similar schools, that there is a desire to have their, ag students or your STEM students to write something beyond just science papers or lab reports. So that kind of makes sense. Yeah.
Okay.
And Eastern, if it is a teacher focused school, that's interesting to know. Yeah, I noticed that a lot of the courses that are taken by students in New Mexico that count for the communication requirement in the state are for educators. So it makes sense that your educators should know how to write if they're going to teach your kids how to write in high school or middle school or even grade school. So it's good to see that they're trying to encourage their educators. You don't see it all that often. I'd have to run the stats for you, but it's not a universal tendency. So it's
All right.
it's promising.
Well, so let's bring out other states and whatnot. How does New Mexico compare, especially the state schools? And we mentioned earlier, you did, that we're a heavily government school focused, especially when you look at the numbers. The size of St. John's College is pretty small.
Yeah.
Where do we stack up, our schools stack up against other states, especially neighboring states? Are we getting the job done in terms of the areas studied, or are we kind of lagging behind typically most of our peer states? I'm talking Arizona, Texas, Colorado, those kinds of places.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'd say that this average, the average grade of the schools in New Mexico, despite St. John's College, is pretty low. You are ranked, if we were to rank all 50 states, you would be at 39th in terms of your core curriculum requirements. And by contrast, Colorado would be 24th, Arizona would be 25th, and even actually California would be 20th, which was a surprise
California.
even to me.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's it's not surprising. New Mexico tends to wind up at the bottom of a lot of those good lists and top of many of the bad ones. And obviously St. John's College, again, I know you can't like manipulate the whole thing and take them out, but yeah, boy, they are such an outlier here in the state of New Mexico. I don't know that I think we were talking on the phone before we did this interview, and I think I've met one person that went to St. John's here in New Mexico, and stuck around, because a lot of the people that come there are from out of state, and a lot of them go back to wherever they come from. So anyway, well, what are your recommendations? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that matters, right? So, even if they're only graduating, I don't know, 100 per year or something like that, if they stick around in Santa Fe, that could affect New Mexico culture in some positive ways. But, if they're dispersing, like happens at a lot of private schools after graduation, then they're not going to necessarily give positive movement to New Mexico culture as much. So
sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Mhm.
is improving this as simple as the legislature just passing requirements that literature, foreign language, government history, economics, and math here in New Mexico as well as composition be added to the curriculum, or how do you recommend that policymakers wrestle with this in the case where it is a government institution, where obviously it's private? Certainly that's a different ball of wax, but.
Yeah. So one change that has gained a fair amount of traction in recent years, and you've probably heard about, is civics requirements. And usually those line up quite nicely with the U.S. government or history requirement that we look at. So either a civics course or passing a very rigorous college level exam in either something about the founding documents or American history or government. At this point, most recent legislatures to pass this type of legislation would be Florida and Arizona, speaking to, your peer states. Arizona's is still in the works, I think, in terms of how they're finally going to implement it. But unfortunately, California has a similar American institutions, I think it's called, requirement, and they do schools find you loopholes. So part of it is keeping, again, kind of going back to that accountability thing, keeping colleges accountable, if it's a public school, to the legislature and the public, being aware of what's actually going on behind the walls, right, or inside the walls, and then making that available, that information available to other people. But anyway, I think one very positive step in most cases is having a rigorous and well-defined civics requirement at the state legislature level. Because that good definition makes it hard for there to be loopholes, right? So South Carolina passed the REACH Act last year, and that's a pretty good one because it says it has to include founding documents. We'd love to see that the whole course is kind of focused on American history as well within that legislation. So yeah, that's one way in one part of our 7 subject areas. I think another thing to keep in mind is even when something is required, we don't always give quote unquote credit for that subject area, because for instance, Highlands, I'd love to hear more about what New Mexicans think of Highlands. But Highlands is interesting because it could have gotten at least a C in our grades. It has an F right now with just one subject area, but it requires literature actually. It's just that it requires it requires literature with so many different options of how to fulfill it, including linguistics, including introduction to digital storytelling, and all kinds of really obscure and like kind of fun courses that might be just something you could take on the side, not even at college, that ends up not counting for literature. So
Okay.
those are some things to keep in mind, right?
I'm not going to give a broad perspective on Highlands. It's in northern New Mexico. They've got some branch campuses. Certainly here, when you talk about New Mexico schools, University of New Mexico and NMSU are the 2 big state schools. And then you've got the others that are more regionally focused. But I would say that in general, if you're looking from outside the states, there's not a lot that you're going to say, this or that in New Mexico really stands out as something to attract people from other states. And I was about to talk to you about this, but one of the things that we do here in New Mexico and have really gone further on, higher education's always been very heavily subsidized by the state of New Mexico with relatively low tuition prices. It's reflected in your report, but now the governor and the legislature have adopted the zero tuition free college model. Obviously, that doesn't apply to St. John's, but it applies to all these state schools. And I'm looking at the 4-year graduation rates that you post in this report. UNM leads the pack at 34%. Highlands, you mentioned them at 18%. I mean, maybe I'm old school, but those seem like very, very low 4-year graduation rates. And then the free college on top of that. I'll just open up to your comments on either or both of those subjects combined, and how that you see them impacting overall accountability and whatnot in higher education.
Absolutely. So can't speak as much to kind of the legislative and government question of how one pays for free college. But I can speak to the fact that yes, New Mexico does have a very low statewide four-year graduation rate. In fact, it's 45th in the nation according to our rankings currently. It's at 29% average. So 45th out of 50. So pretty low. What you say makes sense to me. But I'm certainly no expert that, having basically kind of no barrier in some ways to entering college may encourage those many people that are not really invested, in terms of workload and psychology in college to start trying it out and then dropping out. That makes sense. But on the other hand, I would say it can be positive because there could be people that really would never have tried their hands at four-year institutions that would have only gone for your community college setup or tech school that could now feel empowered. So I could see it cutting both ways.
Yeah, and just to be candid, New Mexico has a highly challenged K-12 system, and as I mentioned, there's a lot of subsidies and incentives for people to attend those in-state schools. So you're kind of reinforcing, drawing on a population that may not be necessarily prepared for college, and it's a challenging thing to get those students in and get them up to speed and get them out in 4 years. So they may need more remedial courses, and if they eventually get that college diploma, then that's okay. But obviously, for a lot of people, dropping out is worse than never having gone to school at all. That, as I understand it from national reports. So
no, I think that, it makes sense, right? It would be really demoralizing. But yeah, you're right? Like if New Mexico is going to rate 51st in the nation, that new NAEP report that came out, at the K-12 level, it is very concerning that students aren't going to reach college with that level of readiness that other states students may have on average. Then one thing I should mention is we only include four-year graduation rates for colleges. A lot of times colleges will sneakily include their 8-year graduation rates or
8-year.
Oh yeah.
8-year. Wow. Well, I guess Animal House lives, huh? 8 years.
So it's something to keep in mind. Like when you or your listeners are checking out a college's statistics, make sure they're talking about their 4-year graduation rate if that's something you're looking into. But yes, going into the question you're concerned about, no incentives to finish if you're not paying another year's tuition could easily extend your stay beyond 8 years. So
okay, so we've just got a few minutes to go, but you rank in this report all of these different areas. It's got to be tough to judge quality though, because with everything going on in higher education and now K-12, there's a lot of, not, I guess for lack of a word, fluff and or woke agenda in some of these institutions. Do you have any way to filter out programs that are just too kind of off the reservation in terms of their the way they approach these issues, or is it good enough to kind of have these topics taught in school, even if it might be a very distorted version of, say, U.S. government history?
Well, so there are kind of two types of standards it sounds like you're talking about here. One is kind of rigor and a certain level academically that is college level. And then another that is content that is, I guess you could say, mainstream and sort of essential for any American citizen to come out of college knowing, right? And to go into the workplace knowing that it's not necessarily about level. It could be a very rigorous sociology course on the 1619 project or something, I guess. But But that is maybe not the absolute essentials for you to learn about, when you're trying to vote, say yesterday on election day. So on the first point, we find that, so we actually our project reviews all the course descriptions of every course that could qualify. So we will look at whether a math course looks remedial, whether a writing course looks remedial. Oftentimes colleges will call it that, but they won't always. So we look and see if it seems serious. Sometimes we'll go as far as looking at syllabi and see if it's really college level. That comes up most often with composition and mathematics, but it can come up also with, a civics course. It could be a really, really basic civics exam that students can pass and then just pass their requirement. So again, I think going back to the point I was making earlier, having a really clear description, whether you're going to have legislation going on, whether you're, in your legislature, whether it's your university writing its course catalog, or a faculty writing a syllabus, is really going to help students, parents make those decisions that are wise and know that they are getting that level of seriousness in their education. Okay, on to the second point you were making about kind of diversity requirements and sort of woke education that's maybe less essential. It's maybe more niche and not aligned necessarily with the founding principles of this country. Or the things that unify us all in the West. So we are willing to take kind of global literature courses as much as we're willing to take a Shakespeare course. But in terms of US government or history, we really look for a broad survey. This is true of literature too, kind of a broader survey course, or at least a course on some author or some series of authors over several decades that are very relevant to the history of literature. The same would go with US history. We don't do, the history of baseball. While it may be interesting, that is not a foundational and essential course. That is something that a professor is interested in and students will take for fun. It is not something you need to come out of college knowing. You need to come out of college knowing your Constitution, knowing, the separation of powers, that sort of thing. And for literature, same thing. You don't know your Shakespeare, at least at a basic level. You don't know something about the history of literature beyond Shakespeare. You've lost out. So we prefer to look for surveys.
Okay, good deal. Well, the report is very interesting. It is available at whatwilltheylearn.com. Any other information you'd like to share briefly, Veronica, before we wrap up this conversation?
No, I guess just we are going to send out copies of hard copy of the report to anyone that's interested. So if you are interested in that, feel free to reach out to us on the website. There's a contact us form, but definitely check us out if you
And it's
you are looking at colleges.
The ACTA website, or what will they learn?
Oh, whatwilltheylearn.com. You're
Okay.
also welcome to check out the ACTA website, goacta.org. There are lots of exciting things happening on the academic freedom question, and as well as academic excellence and beyond. So, but yes, particularly I'm reaching out to my prospective college students. If you are really puzzled at what's the best school, we have a range of things that aren't just curricular, but like Mr. Gessing mentioned, right? Like tuition rates, four-year graduation rates, student loan default rates, maybe less relevant for New Mexico proper at this point, but there's there's a lot to learn. Also, free speech, climate issues on campus are mentioned. So.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, Veronica. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube and Rumble channels. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.